The bullet should have killed me. Instead, it crowned me above a sea of gray fog. A hall unrolled from the mist as if memory had been poured into architecture and set to harden. Pillars without capitals or end steps that rose from nowhere to an invisible dais, a bronze-minus dark table long enough to host a council of the dead. Chairs faced me whose backs were stitched with star-minus patterns I couldn't name. The air tasted like old paper and thunder. My right hand shook once and stilled when I pressed it to the tabletop. It felt warm, like a hearth that remembered a family. Two figures coalesced across from me as if the fog had decided on them. One looked like a sailor roughed by weather and secrets, shoulders squared because seas do not pity slouching men. The other was a young woman with a posture that told of recitals and tutors. Her gaze had the brightness of someone taught to see the world as a solvable puzzle. Both were a little unreal, edges smudged by that crimson tint that haunts dreams in the moments before waking. "Where is this?" the sailor asked, lowering his voice in a way that assumed ships listened. He did not ask who I was. He was already measuring me. The young woman's question arrived softer but cut cleaner. "Are we dead?" It sounded more like an experiment than a fear. I did not know. I could lie, or I could choose an answer that would keep me alive long enough to learn the truth. The chair at the head of the table waited, heavy with an expectation that felt nothing like invitation and everything like duty. I sat because refusing a stage does not unbuild the theater. "I am a host," I said, "not a god." The sentence surprised me with its balance. "Call me the fool." The word fit like a key turned from the wrong side of a door, their attention pinned to me. The fog accepted the name and folded it into its weather. Somewhere beneath the table, no, beneath the hall itself, something deep and slow pulsed as if the world had a heartbeat and was politely waiting for me to speak between its beats. I set my palm on the bronze again and felt it throb once. The gray fog did not move, but my thoughts did. They lurched back to a mirror, a wound, and a moon that was the color of a fresh bruise. Tinyon by night wears its own fog, not the gray of this hall, but the kind that climbs out of alleys and hangs against street lamps until every pool of light looks like a question. On the worst evenings, a crimson ring halo at the moon, and no one could agree whether it was weather or omen. The night my life changed, the ring was too bright to be polite. I woke because pain does not ask permission. It flashed at my right temple with the clean, dry bite of a paper cut made of lightning. For a second the room was a smear, then the spinning slowed and the edges returned to the world. Floorboards, a cheap table with one leg shim met by a folded newspaper, coats on a nail. I recognized none of it and all of it. The way you recognize a song you've never heard because your hands already know where the notes will fall. The mirror over the wash basin offered a face I wore like a borrowed coat. The man staring back had my eyes because I was using them, but everything else felt like an inheritance with strings attached. Pale, a little gaunt, a faint bruise at the hairline where the pain had bloomed. I raised my fingers, the mirror-minus man raised his. They touched cold glass at the same moment, and for the briefest shiver I thought I felt someone on the other side touch back. The drawer stuck once before giving up its grip on the revolver. Metal kissed palm. 6 chambers, 1 empty, the smell of oil not recent enough. Beneath it lay a notebook, the sort bought by people who believe that writing is a way to convince themselves of continuity. The scrawl on the first page listed expenditures and bread prices, then tumbled into something that wasn't accounting. "If I fail," a line said, "surprisingly neat. Tell Melissa the heater is safe now." Melissa. The name struck bone. My mouth said it as if confirming the words still fit. A sister, a genius with gears and stubbornness if the flood of images belonged to me. A kitchen where everything hung on a nail because drawers were for people with money. A brother too serious for his age because someone had to be. The memory settled almost where they should be. Almost. I pressed a cloth against the tender spot at my temple and counted the rhythm of ache. There were traces of incense in the room and the sweet minus ire aftertaste of blood that had been washed, but not entirely forgiven by the basin. On the windowsill, a little stack of coins sat under a chipped saucer, and next to them a strip of paper held a line of symbols that looked like someone had tried to write with a ruler and a migraine. When I breathed on it, the symbols coiled, then straight and as if embarrassed to be seen moving. The city below the window went about its night. Tram bill, a peddler's last, loose shout, the far dog who argued with the moon. I wrapped the revolver in an old shirt, slid the notebook into my coat and went downstairs. If the night wanted to confess, it wouldn't do it in my room. The landlord's cat blinked at me from the stair. I passed him like a penitent passes a saint, without eye contact and unconvincing humility. Outside, the rain had already made up its mind, a fine patient kind that does its work while you are busy denying it. I pulled my collar up and went toward the market where the tents gather like mushrooms after a storm. Tingen's market by night is a different country than by day. By daylight, it sells peppers and twine and gossip that can be safely repeated. By night, it sells answers. A canvas triangle painted with a hand, and I had appeared near the pump. A clown-nosed man in a threadbare tailcoat performed predictions for coins. He told a bricklayer that love would arrive on a fish cart. After he promised a widow the winter would spare her roof. Applause, he advised a thief to change alleys. Silence, then a coin anyway. I watched, and the world watched back through the audience, which is to say no one truly watched me. That suited me. The tailcoat man saw my coat and named my hunger, then called me up with a grin to flatter the crowd. He placed a deck on my palm. The cards were warm with the sweat of people who wanted to believe paper could be persuaded to leak the future. Draw, he said, stage minus low. Slowly, I drew. The picture flashed the way lightning does behind your eyelids. A figure stepping toward a cliff with a flower in his hand, and a smile that might be faith or ignorance, a son that didn't care which. The fool. The crowd liked it because they were primed to like anything that joined symbol to spectacle. The tailcoat man liked it because every story needs a beginning. I did not like it, but I could not deny the ring. It set vibrating inside my ribs. The card's edges dug in each square into my skin when I pressed it, as if promising a bruise I wouldn't be able to show anyone. On my way out, I paused at a neighboring tent that had no queue. Its sign had been written by a careful hand that had run out of conviction before it ran out of paint. Rituals of luck, simple prayers, small favors. Inside, a woman with tired hair and kind wrist sold candles and little folded pamphlets. She said my headache would pass if I stopped worrying what caused it. I bought a candle anyway because kindness is a craft and crafts deserve to be paid. The pamphlet took the long road to explain a short ritual. Wash the hands, draw a circle, place the candle, speak as minus plain words with a straight back. It promised nothing, only an audience. That honesty frightened me more than the clown's confidence. I paid with 2 coins that should have been bread and left before I could decide to be sensible. By the time I returned to the building, the fog had thickened into the stairwell. The landlord's cat had moved up to steps and continued his silent guard against whatever it is cats believe they hold back by staring. My room tasted of cool tea. I set the candle on a saucer, drew a circle on the floor with a stub of chalk I'd found among Melissa's things, and washed my hands until the water ran clear of any excuses. Just an audience, I said to the room and to the mirror that refused to forgive the bruise at my temple. And then I'll sleep. And then I'll wake, and everything will be ordinary in a way I can survive. The circle accepted the candle without drama. I lit the wick, and the little flame behaved itself, the way fire behaves around people who have not yet given it a reason to rejoice. The pamphlet prescribed no saints and forbade none. Asked minus plain, it said, I cleared my throat and rid my words of ornament as if removing jewelry before work. I need work that won't kill me before rent is due, I said, because lying to ritual seems like a poor investment. I need to keep my sister warm. I need to know why there was blood in my basin when I cannot remember providing it. The flame did not flutter. I added the last thing, the part that had been darting just out of the net of my sentences. And if there is a way to go back to the moment before a bullet chose me, I want to learn its name. Silence sat down beside me. I could hear the clock next door limping around its hour. Somewhere below, a neighbor coughed, the kind of cough that pays rent to winter. I felt absurd. The pamphlet had not promised trumpets. I pinched the bridge of my nose and let the headache roll over me like a small tide. When I opened my eyes, the candle's flame had lengthened. It was not taller, it was deeper, as if it had discovered a second dimension and decided to explore. The room tilted. The circle lifted. The floor forgot itself. I stood where I had begun the night, above a gray fog that hid its own horizon. The bronze table waited with the patience of old trees. The chairs drew breath in a way that was not breath. I wanted to laugh, which is one of the masks of terror. Instead, I set my hand to the tabletop and felt again that slow, courteous pulse answer me from below. You came back, said the young woman with the tutor's posture. She had not been in my room. She had no right to be here in the second place after the first impossibility. Yet there she was, looking relieved in the way people are relieved when a hypothesis survives its first trial. The sailor's eyes flicked to my empty hands, to the candle stain that wasn't there but should have been, to the bruise that had not yet decided on its final color. Looks like the host found the door. He glanced toward the fog as if somewhere in it lay a map, and he had sworn never to read it without pay. Or the door found him. I had no doctrine to offer them. I had a chair. I sat. The word I had chosen for myself earlier still clung to the air like the aftertaste of a struck match. Fool. There are worse names to start with. Most of them are lies that take years to return to truth. I folded my hands to stop them from broadcasting my tremor. The fog tight and pleasantly around the hall as if pleased to be useful. "You ask for luck," the young woman said as if she had been listening near my ceiling. "Is this it?" "It's an audience," I answered, borrowing the pamphlet's honesty. "What we say now may teach us how to ask for more." The sailor's mouth recognized the shape of a smile and refused to complete it. "Then ask." "I did not ask for money, not first. I asked for order, for the right names of things, for the exact address of the pain at my temple and the route the bullet had or had not taken when physics shrugged." The questions made a sound in the hall that I felt in my teeth. The fog did not speak words back. It produced certainty instead, brick by invisible brick, the way a skilled mason works at night to leave daylight surprised by a new wall. I knew, without proof I could export to anyone not seated here, that the door between my room and this hall was not an accident. It was an arrangement. Luck is a vulgar word for an arrangement of doors. I had arranged one. The realization steadied me more than any lie could have done. "Good," I said to them and to myself. "Then we can be useful to one another." The sailor looked as if he had just heard a fair wage named. The young woman's shoulders dropped the way shoulders do when the right theorem clicks into place. The hall's pulse quickened by a fraction and subsided again, a tide respecting a harbor's curve. "I will speak and you will listen," I said, not because I wanted to command, but because someone had to provide a sentence sturdy enough to hold the shape of the moment. If we keep our names close and our bargains closer, we might survive what brought us here. Their attention did not waver. The fog did not either. Even the silence seemed braced to carry weight. I leaned forward. "First," I said, "we decide what to call the rules." Morning dragged me out of the hall with the unromantic insistence of light through thin curtains. I woke on the floorboards with a clean circle scuffed into chalk dust and a candle that had burned down farther than its wick should account for. My mouth tasted like I'd argued with a storm and won on a technicality. The bruise at my temple had submitted to a more dignified ache. From the courtyard came the clack of Melissa's tool. She talks with steel and makes points with screws. She was humming in a key that admits no nonsense. I washed, none the wiser and entirely changed. The mirror offered me the same borrowed face. But some negotiation had occurred in the night, and I owned it a little more. The revolver sat in the drawer like an ugly truth I was not yet done with. I left it there and counted coins. The saucer was lighter by 2 lessons and heavier by 1 address. Below, the landlord's cat allowed me to pass without comment. On the stoop, Benson greeted me with a nod that conceded I existed and was probably not making his life harder at this exact moment. He had the air of a young man pretending to be older for everyone's sake. He asked whether I had slept. I said yes, which in a sense was true. He looked relieved by the lie because older brothers are fluent in useful fictions. Melissa wiped her hands on a rag and told me the heater would not burst even if someone foolishly fed it twice the usual pressure. Then she looked at my eyes too long and asked whether I had been dreaming. I said I had drawn a circle and it had behaved. She accepted that, not because it was satisfying, but because we were late for the day and hunger argues louder than metaphysics. We ate. Bread tastes better after you have negotiated with fog. We worked. The city breathed, coughed, and laughed in the appropriate places. I carried the address of the Grey Hall around like a matchbook in my pocket. At noon, at the pump where the clown sold omens, the card table was empty. The tent with the careful hand had already been folded. That night, I drew no circle. That night, I slept the sleep of a man who has learned that the universe will answer if you ask politely and pronounce its name with the exact courtesy it requires. I woke before dawn with a plan that was not a plan so much as a direction. If the door admitted me, perhaps it would admit listeners. If listeners came, perhaps we could lend one another exactly what we lacked without ever naming the lack aloud. I made tea and wrote a list I did not title. Luck, work, truth about the wound. Money gentle as rain, not money that arrives like a wave and steals your footing. Warmth form, Elisa. Breathing room for Benson. A clean exit from whatever bargain had been struck the night before my first memory began. When the hour was reasonable for people who work with their hands, I found a quiet place and said yes minus playing words to the air without chalk or candle. The air did not answer. Fair enough. Doors have hours. I folded the paper, tucked it inside the notebook, and went to the market to watch people by what they could afford to believe. By evening, I was tired in the honest way. The fog in the hall had spoiled me. Ordinary fog felt underdressed. I climbed the stairs with a bag of potatoes, and the certainty a map gives a traveler when he has learned not to trust every river drawn in blue. The candle sat where I had left it, instantly shorter. I set it back on its saucer and saved it for when honesty required ceremony. I was not brave. I was not brilliant. I was pragmatic in the way of a man who has been introduced to a new rule and is still alive. That is a kind of courage when it has no banner. When sleep came, it found me writing the word "fool" on a scrap and then striking it through, not because the name was wrong, but because I had already used it and did not want to give it away twice. Names are tools. Names are bridges. Names are doors. I slept with a door in my pocket, and the city turned another page. The thing about rules is that you don't know you've made them until you test their edges. I had a circle, a candle, a name I could say without flinching. I also had rent due in 6 days. Mysteries and landlords do not recognize each other's authority. Work found me the way a cart finds a rut. Inevitable once the angle is wrong. A clerk from a warehouse near the river needed a day's help reconciling tallies. Crates in, crates out, crates that had never been and yet had somehow generated a fee. Numbers calm me. They repeat themselves just enough to be predictable and disobey just enough to keep you honest. I copied, added, subtracted. The smell of hemp, rope and damp boards worked its way into my coat. The river gnawed at its banks and pretended it was thinking. Around noon, the foreman's boy waved a handle near the stove, chasing heat into his sleeves. "Ring moon tonight," he said to no one. "Pastor says keep shutters tight, say your little prayers if you've got them." The room took the news the way men take weather, with competence and a denial that has earned its pension. I pretended my pencil needed sharpening and listened for whether the word ritual made anyone look up. It didn't. In this city, everyone has their private method of persuading the future to be reasonable. On my way home, I took the long street that sells things to people who want to fix other things. Brass, screws, spring wire. A man I recognized and could not place leaned in a doorway and watched me in the narrow, companionable way some debts do. He didn't follow. He just measured. I walked like a person whose only interesting feature was his shopping list. Melissa had the heater apart again. Her hair had made a practical arrangement with a piece of string. She announced that one valve would have lied to us next winter, and then drop minus kicked our savings. She had fixed its capacity for treachery. Bents unreturned with flour and a rumor about a watch patrol doubling rounds on the inner streets. We ate with the silence of people who would rather have talked than discovered we were too tired to begin. In that kind of quiet, you can hear your own thoughts stray on other voices. Mine tried on the sailor's and the young woman's and found both too large in the shoulders. Night made a reasonable offer. I lit the candle and read the pamphlet again. It still refused to promise anything more specific than attention. The circle chalked itself under my hand with a steady line, the confidence of a will minus made tool. I washed my hands even though I had already washed them as if cleanliness were a password and I wanted to pronounce it correctly. "Ask plain," I said to the room, "and mind your manners." The hall opened without drama. I am not sure whether that disappointed or relieved me. The bronze table held its ground against the nothing. The chairs were already arranged as if an invisible footman had known how many guests to expect. The fog breathed once and stilled. They came with the same shortcuts as last time. Presence, then outline, then detail. The sailor's beard had picked up a silver thread I did not remember perhaps my attention had. The young woman stood as if something on the far side of propriety interested her. They took their seats as if obeying a gravity I had paid for. "We should not give names," I began. "Not yet. Call me the fool. Call him." I nodded toward the sailor. "The hanged man." The title fit him with a severity I respected. "And you," I said to the young woman, who had the precise gaze of a person trained to balance mercy with accuracy or justice. She accepted the word with the kind of smile you can hear even if you close your eyes. The sailor did not smile. He let the name settle into his coat like a concealed blade and checked that it did not catch. "Rules," I said. Saying the word here made it heavier. "No questions about birth names. No questions about addresses. We trade in problems and payments, not in proofs. If what you ask requires coin, you'll pay coin. If it requires time, we'll count time. If it requires luck, we low luck, and that is the most expensive debt." The hanged man folded his hands, finding a position that made his scars less interested in arguing. "And you," he said mildly, "are the banker?" "I am the table," I said, because humility is cheaper when it is true. Treat the hall as a place where arrangements can be made and not unmade. We meet when the door opens. If you can influence that, do so sparingly. Just as his attention flicked toward the emptiness above the far end of the table, the place where a chair taller than the rest might someday pretend to be a throne and just fail. "What can the fog do?" she asked. The question sounded like a diagram waiting to be labeled. "It listens," I said. "It offers shape. It enforces bargains we consent to. It does not provide miracles on demand. I was learning the rules as I spoke them and hated how natural it felt. Start with little uses. Favors that could be explained away if needed. Silence did the work that questions do when they realize answers are shy. The hanged man gave a sailor's shrug that covered continents. A crewman of mine, he said, owes a gentleman more money than anyone ought to owe a gentleman who smiles like that. The crewman's mother will be visited if the debt is not made to look smaller by end of week. I require a method to make numbers obey. He glanced at me as if to see whether my hall respected arithmetic. Numbers are obedient creation, I said, but men who collect them are not. I considered. This would have been a place to promise a thunderclap. I promised labor instead. Bring me the ledger. No names, I added, because the hall liked its privacy, and will look for weight that can be shifted without breaking the scale. I will not counterfeit, but I will rearrange a pattern until it tells the truth that hurts least. He grunted. For a man like that, trust is the sound a ship makes when it decides not to split. Just a lean forward, lowering her voice because the fog, like all good rooms, rewards confidences. I have access to 2 rooms where decisions are dressed up as conversations. I'm told to sit still and take notes. She paused, the way a dancer pauses between beats to decide whether jump. If I wanted to discourage a particular unwholesome enterprise, within the letter of the rules, could this place teach me how to lay the smallest stone in the road that would make a carriage will think twice? I liked her immediately and decided to like her with caution. Bring me the shape of the road, I said, and we'll test small stones here before you spend them there. This hall is good for rehearsing disasters in miniature. She smiled with her eyes and made the mistake I would have made at her age. She looked up as if a teacher might write in a beside her idea. The fog offered no grades, only the absence of reprimand. We did not speak longer than the candle would allow. Back in my room, the wick had become a dark comma. The chalk circle looked tired but unbroken. I covered it with the rug so Melissa wouldn't trip, and because it felt vulgar to leave it or uncovered in a room where people sleep. Weekdays till they run downhill faster than Sundays. Work, bread. A laugh that belonged to someone 2 doors down. A letter I did not open because the envelope had the oily sheen of a problem that wants to live on your table. I kept my head low and my eyes up. The man who had measured me in the doorway did not reappear. Other men did. A pair with redeemable boots loitered outside the bakery at odd hours and discovered reason to examine the same lamppost whenever I passed. A third whistled the same 4 bars of a melody nobody knows and refused to finish it. I cataloged them out of habit. The habit felt older than my current head. That night, the hall received a ledger that had been cleaned by a conscience with dirty water. The hangman set it on the table as if he were surrendering a knife. He left his hand on it, a second longer than ceremony required. Numbers glowered. I read them as if they were a language I had been punished for speaking as a child. Patterns mutter when they are caught. This one muttered about a shortfall that migrated like a clever bird. I showed him where it nested. He said nothing, which was gratitude in a dialect I preferred to the kind that speaks. Just as broad a diagram that called itself a luncheon seating plan and was actually the first paragraph of a speech that would eventually legislate someone's body. We moved the chairs 1 place to the left and set a plate where it could begin a new argument simply by existing. She understood and looked briefly ill. Then she looked determined, which is the same expression adjusted by a decision. We were not heroes. We made adjustments. Luck noticed us. It always does. It prefers small investments that compound. The men by the lamppost upgraded to men who exchanged remarks with the butcher and did not buy meat. I took a different route home and discovered that the different route already had a man on it. The kind who thinks the world owes his hat respect. He trailed me as far as the pump, then reconsidered public spaces. I smiled at the clown in the tailcoat who had returned with a colleague whose nose had lost the will to be funny. The tailcoat flicked a card from a sleeve because people love proof that hands are clever. It was not the fool. I kept walking until the world narrowed to my stairwell. The landlord's cat had moved to the 3rd step and announced new policy by posture. Pay toll and scratches. I paid. At my door, a paper had been pushed under so carefully the bottom edge lined up with the board seat. I picked it up by 1 corner because letters heavier than their weight deserve caution. The handwriting had been taught by someone who hit knuckles for loops. You are conducting an authorized observances, it said without reading. Next time, do not do it alone. That could have been a kindness. It could have been a threat. It could have been the sentence people say just before the door behind you stops being a door and starts being a wall. I set the note on the table and breathed on it, the way I had breathed on the strip of symbols, nothing curled or straight, and the paper remained paper. The letter remained a letter, which meant the danger would be delivered by a person and not by flame. I did not light the candle that night. If someone had an ear shut against my keyhole, I wanted him to hear nothing but potatoes boiling and my sister laughing at her own joke. We washed. We pretended that the city ended at our door. When sleep came, it found me on my side, counting the spaces between footfalls on the street and fitting each one with an imagined face. In the morning, I bought bread from a woman who had been denied a daughter's wedding and never forgave the price of sugar for it. She told me the pastor had taken ill in the night, nothing mortal, the kind of illness a man gets when too many people tell him their dreams as if he knows where to store them. I nodded, thanked her for the extra heel, and spent the day at the warehouse relieving their tallies from dishonesty's little errors. At dusk, the hanged man returned to the hall with the ghost of a grin and a cut on his knuckle that had been washed in a bucket. The gentleman's arithmetic suffered a small accident, he said, the way a man might speak of weather that sank a rival's boat but spared his. The crewman's mother will host no visits this week. He slid a modest purse across the table as if he were paying the hall and not me. Perhaps he was. Justice brought news that the seating plan had seduced its author into a different speech altogether, one that lacked the knife it had been reaching for. A delay is sometimes a mercy, she said, examining her own hands as if they belonged to someone whose decisions she could still amend. But I think it's more than a delay. Carry the stone only as far as the wheel, I said. If you throw it, someone else will call you the villain. The phrase sounded older than I was. The fog accepted it with a sigh, as if it had been waiting to hear someone say the thing aloud. The letter under my door had not mentioned a schedule for its advice. It had not signed a name I could set on the table and interrogate. I stopped expecting either. Instead, I began to carry around a second arrangement in my pocket. If someone decided to supervise me, I would let myself be supervised until supervision told me what it wanted. The men at the lamppost retired. New men discovered interest in a fruit cart that had never been so fascinating. On the second night of their appointment, I turned a corner to quickly and met a shoulder that had been bred for doors. We apologized in the city's way, by checking our pockets afterwards. Mine still contained the notebook, the list, and enough coins to tempt greed, but not courage. The man's eyes were gray without fog. He smelled faintly of the river and of lime, the kind used by men who clean up after other men's choices. Wrong turn, he said conversationally. All my turns are, I said with a smile I did not feel. It keeps life honest. He held my gaze long enough to count the lies I wasn't telling. If you ever need help asking the right questions, he said, there are people who charge less than priests and more than runks. He tapped his hat and left me the way a cat leaves a bird it could catch later. The second man down the street laughed once and stopped. I climbed the stairs thinking of prices. The candle sat on its saucer the way a dog sits who knows whether it will be walked. I lit it, drew the circle, washed my hands not because I intended to use the door, but because the door has its own expectations, and neglect is a language even rooms can read. Then I blew the flame out and waited, listening to the walls for the sound of someone who believed in miracles more than I do. No one came. Sometimes that is the miracle. In the hall, when I returned the following night, the fog felt closer to the table, like a curtain drawn in against weather. We divided a problem in three and found that two of its parts wanted to be solved and the third preferred to linger. We dismissed lingering with an agreement to revisit it only if it learned to misbehave more honestly. Eustace laughed, surprised at herself. The hanged man told a story about a storm that tore the names off boats and how men got lost, not because they couldn't see home, but because they didn't know what to call it anymore. Names, I said. Doors. I could feel the shape of a larger architecture just beyond speech, the way you can feel the sea before you hear it. I did not reach for it. Every rule I had so far found had offered itself the rules you seize before they introduce themselves extract a price. When I left, I stepped into a stairwell that smelled of hot iron and rain. The landlord's cat was absent. The absence was its own alarm. Under my door lay another paper, folded twice, neat as gilt. I slid it up with my shoe until I could trap it under my heel and stoop as if tying a lace. This hand was less educated. The next raid minus ring night it said, don't stay home. That was advice, threat, and invitation in one sentence. I read it twice to see whether the ink changed its mind. It didn't. The kettle began to sing. Somewhere outside, someone laughed the way people laugh when they are trying to teach their fear to hear. I set the note beside the first. The table accepted its new weight. The candle flickered as if practicing for a wind. The floorboards remembered how to creak in the place that makes you think a man is standing behind you when he isn't. I said, to the room, to the gray hall, to the city as a whole. All right then, the rage ring was due in 3 nights. I had time to choose what kind of fool I wanted to be. The raid ring had a calendar's confidence. 3 nights is plenty of time to prepare if you know what you're preparing for. I didn't. That forced me to prepare for everything, which is another way of saying I tidied the room and put my affairs in a pocket. I made a list Melissa would approve of, beginning with items and ending with reasons. Jog, string, a small mirror no larger than a biscuit, 2 copper coins, 1 clean, 1 scarred, a candle stub and a box of matches guarded like royalty, the revolver I still didn't love but refused to abandon, a folded scrap with the straightest words I could find. Keep my sister warm, keep my brother unafraid, keep my head. At noon, the church bell dropped its notes down the street like stones into water. I attended out of superstition and because the best place to read a city is where it sits still. The pastor looked thinner in daylight, as if belief charged a fee in sunlight. He preached warnings soft enough to pass as advice. Shudders, prayer, restraint. He never said red ring, which made everyone think it louder. I stood in the back with men who smell of rope and grain. A woman with gray hair touched my sleeve and said the sentence people use when they want to be kind without being implicated. Be home early. I told her I would, which by then was already a lie. On the way out, a boy ran the nave with a candle that refused to go out the way boys refuse. The draft drew a figure in smoke that the eye invented and then denied. I watched it vanish and realized my headache had learned my skull's geography and was exploring politely. Work filled the afternoon. The warehouse ledger behaved itself because someone had freight in it recently. I ate bread off a crate and counted the ways a coin can change its mind. When I looked up, the gray-eyed man from the corner had installed himself by the open door, a silhouette in competent boots. You should pick a side before the weather does, he said as if advising me about shoes. His tone was conversational in the way men choose when they would like you to believe you're both on the same pier looking out at the same fog. I have a side, I said, which was true. But he considered that like a craftsman critiquing a joint. If the ring puts you outside, head for the old tenement off Mill Lane, the one with a staircase that keeps score of every step. Watch from the top. Don't go in. You sell tickets? I sell hints. He touched the brim of his hat as if I paid. You owe me a question answered at a later date? Don't worry. It will be boring. He left with the unearned confidence of someone who has already rehearsed your evening. Back at the apartment, I told Melissa the heater song and would live another year. That was true and earned me the right to a second potato. She took it away and told me to bring back for instead tomorrow. Benson promised to do the morning run so I could finish the warehouse clerk's stuttered sums. We arranged our lives like a deck of cards in a game we pretended did not involve knives. Night came, then minded its business. I drew the circle less perfectly than before and watched the chalk line forgive me. The candle's flame elongated, remembering its trick. The hall exhaled me into itself without asking who I thought I was. That felt like trust or habit, either will do when the work is small. Justice arrived with a map of seating arrangements folded into itself like origami. The hanged man brought a ledger that had learned shame. We traded small stones and rehearsed disasters that would never know we saved them. At the end, when the fog felt friendlier than silence, I tried something I had been carrying around in my throat. I want a listening piece, I said to the table, to the room, to the rule beneath both. Nothing that reaches where it should not, nothing that would embarrass the door. A token that hears the kind of luck that changes whether a street away. The fog does not answer in noises, it answers by making you aware that you are already holding what you asked for if only you would decide what to call it. I set the clean copper coin in my palm, then the scarred one. The clean coin warmed first, the way bread warms in a pocket even when you've forgotten it's there. The scarred one cooled like a decision. I threaded the warm coin onto a string and wore it under my shirt where hearts have seniority. Just as swatched with the benign envy of a student who knows a clever proof when she sees one. The hanged man accepted that he would never ask for that, and that this was wisdom rather than poverty. We quit the hall before the candle forgot how to be fired. I slept as if practice could be hoarded. The second day was mean with rain. Melissa tuned the heater's temper with a wire no thicker than a rumor. Benson brought home flour and news of a patrol change that put bored men where they could see too much. I measured out my coins and bought a second mirror because there are days when you will need the truth to look at itself. By dusk the city smelled of metal and damp wool. The red ring poured itself over the moon like a careful crime. Windows blinked shut, doors remembered how to be doors. The note under my floorboard, because I had learned to keep such things there, said don't stay home and itched my foot to agreement. I told Benson I needed air and told Melissa I would be quick. Neither was a lie if you changed the meaning of quick to fit the size of an evening. The street wore its best version of empty. That is the kind of empty full of men who have decided to be shadows tonight. Mill Lane began as a mistake and then turned into a street. The tenement the gray-eyed man meant to have been started by optimism and stopped by arithmetic. For floor stood the fifth had given up after a railing and 3 bricks. The staircase counted each foot that climbed it like an old shopkeeper tracking credit. I went up to the top where the roof should have been and found a view the city didn't sell. Warehouse roofs, ragged chimneys, and narrow glint of river. The market tents folded into dark triangles like quiet prayers. The coin under my shirt was warmer than the part of me that worried. I breathed, evenly so fear wouldn't begin composing demands. Somewhere below, and in someone else's story and shut softly enough to be interesting. 2 men walked the alley under me, then 3, then 5, then 2 again. They moved like grammar. Function mattered more than names. A lantern's light discovered a hand for a second and forgot it. Farther off, a whistle asked a question that patrolmen use when they have decided not to arrest anyone. A figure stepped into the yard beside the tenement and left the gate ajar with the casual cruelty of people who expect to be obeyed by objects. He carried a box with the modest bravado of a thing that has been wrapped to look harmless. Another brought a bundle that clinked once and was forever sorry it had. The third man did not carry anything. He carried the right to speak. They arranged themselves under a broken lintel as if trying on an architecture for size. I did not go in. I had promised a man who sells hints. I also wanted to see the kind of ritual that uses night like a cloth. From my perch, the mirror gave me a second angle on the alley. The glass held a red ring in miniature and made the men look like they were arguing inside an eye. The coin at my chest ticked 1 degree hotter when the box opened. I did not see inside. I saw the way the other 2 held their shoulders in the instant after and chose not to breathe. That told me enough. The third man's voice reached me in pieces that the wind approved. Phrases about debts, exchanges, permissions. A pattern then, not an invocation. Good. Patterns can be changed without breaking the world. I tested the door the way you test a tooth with your tongue. Not the wooden one below the one made of chalk and copper and breath. Ask mine is plain, I said in my head, so the walls would learn my tricks. I don't want the ritual to hurt anyone who didn't volunteer. I want any circle they draw to find its smallest flaw and tell it to grow a little. The coin agreed by becoming a degree warmer. The mirror's reflection stuttered, the red ring wavered, as if a thin cloud had remembered its job. Below, the men lifted their hands to begin uneat motion and discovered their neat motion required a correction. One man stepped to the left, another lowered his lantern to see who had dreamed the draft. The box wobbled on a crate and almost convinced the bundle to confess. 3 small mistakes became 1 larger pause. Sometimes that's enough to teach a will to think twice. From the corner of the yard, a 4th man coughed a signal that had not been rehearsed in years. This one wore his hat like a promise and his face like a favor owed. The gray-eyed man then, dressed as no one you would point at in a crowd. He leaned into the yard as if asking for a light and found one, the way men do when they plan to talk long enough to remember your name. The 3 glanced at each other, the way conspiracies check their pulse. He kept them talking by handing them questions with comfortable handles. I did nothing noble. I did as asked. I stayed out. I let the coin hum its small disagreement with the circle below. When the lantern wheezed and died, I let the dark assist. One of the men swore the way apprentices swear when a master is watching. The gray-eyed man laughed once in a good-humored way that makes mistakes contagious. The box was closed again with too much ceremony for a thing that had just disappointed its audience. They dispersed, not because they had been stopped, but because they had been reminded of how to doubt themselves. I waited until the alley had emptied even of that. Then I went down the staircase that remembers. 3rd step from the bottom. Someone had carved a mark with a knife to dull for pride. I put my fingertip there and felt the groove fill its memory with my skin. In the yard, the crate wore a ring of dust where the box had sat. On the ground beside it, someone had dropped a chalk stub with a printed band in the middle that said "Keep dry" in letters intended for people who do not keep anything. The chalk was wet. I pocketed it because evidence is just a souvenir that shows you. A shadow detached itself from a deeper shadow and shook rain off a hat. You did well, the gray-eyed man said in the tone a man uses when he wants to see whether you will argue with praise. I didn't do anything, I said. Exactly. He nodded toward the alley mouth where the night had resumed its ordinary business. That was the correct price to pay. What would the wrong price be? Wanting to see how it ends. He glanced at the staircase. That thing keeps score, you know. What does it do with the numbers? Spends them on men who think they invented doors. He pulled a card from his pocket the way magicians do when they're out of patience, and I was relieved to see it was only card minus shaped. In address, a time that did not exist on ordinary clocks. If the note under your door didn't frighten you away, this will annoy you into attending. What are we calling you? Call me what you call everyone in that place of yours when you don't want to be impolite. He almost smiled. Call me a listener. He tipped his hat and disappeared the way rain disappears, by becoming everything else. At home, Benson had left the porch lamp burning like a question. Melissa was asleep at the table with a spring tangled in her fingers, defying physics by resting without letting go. I hung the coin on the bedpost to cool like a kettle. The chalk in my pocket left a ghost lying on the wood when I set it down. The revolver remained in the drawer, exemplary and unused. I did not sleep right away. The city didn't either. It hummed the way a machine hums when someone has oiled it too much. I lay on my back and watched the line of light under the curtain move like a second hand. When it reached the corner and stopped, I blinked and the hall remembered me. The bronze table had a fleck on its surface that had not been there before and was therefore important. The fog was closer to the floor, dignified as old velvet. The hanged man arrived first, salt in his beard and a week's worth of choices on his knuckles, just as followed with her attention already ahead of her. I stayed out, I said, because the room prefers confessions that are also reports. And? The hanged man asked. The circle learned to doubt itself, I said. A man with gray eyes turned out into a plan. No blood. The box went home embarrassed. Just as son folded a hand-drawn seating plan, then folded it again without looking. Sometimes embarrassment is a beginning. She studied the fleck on the table as if it were on a map. What is that? A price paid, I said, surprised I knew it. Luck spends itself where it can be seen. We sat together without speaking longer than rooms allow. I placed the wet chalk on the bronze and watched it decide whether it belonged. The fog accepted it the way a librarian accepts a book, without comment and with perfect memory for who brought it in. We will need more names for the rules, I said, before we are tempted to use them without asking. Just a snotty. The hanged man looked as if he had meant to say the same thing and decided to let me spend the sentence. We left before the candle burned strange. In the morning, the ring had dissolved out of the sky like an apology. The city pretended it had slept well. The men at the lamppost whistled a different tune. The bakery woman remembered my name and forgot the price of sugar for a minute that made her look young. Under my door, a third note. Same careful fold. Same knuckle minus odd hand. We speak soon, it said. Bring the coin. I boiled water and watched steam write its brief letters in air. All right, then, I told the kettle. We speak soon. And the city for once agreed. I did wear the coin on a string that night. I let it ride in my pocket like a second pulse. The address on the card belonged to a street that never makes the guidebooks because it performs the charitable work of connecting to better ones. The R written in a tidy hand pretended it was later than clocks allow. When I arrived, the lamps had already agreed to be fewer than usual. The address turned out to be a tailor shop. That's where it was closed. A sign in the window said alterations in a script that had practiced its loops, as if loops could prove anything. Inside, bolts of fabric like sleeping flags, a body form that had retired from its duties without informing its posture, and a counter with a glass top containing needles that had seen more vows than the church across the square. A bell rang without moving when I opened the door. A voice said from the back, "City mine is broken, not unkind." The kind of voice that doesn't have to shout to be obeyed because it knows where the floorboards complain. Up was a staircase that turned twice before it decided on a landing. The room at the top looked like an argument between a bookshop and a kitchen. Shelves wore ledger backs. The kettle sulked on the hob. A window refused to fit its frame and let in enough night to keep us honest. The gray minus side man, listener by his own christening, stood with his hat off and his caution on. "Coin," he said. I set it on the table because men like him prefer you to put your cards down and asked. He didn't reach, he watched. The coin thought about its options and chose to warm just enough to prove it remembered me. "Good," he said. "Better a common thing with an uncommon habit than the reverse." "What habit?" I asked. "Listening," he said simply. "That coin hears arrangements, nothing with teeth. But if someone nearby tries to persuade the world to be a different shape for a minute, you'll feel the rumor of it." He lifted his eyes. "And the world will feel the rumor of you." I didn't flinch. I saved the flinch for later. "Who are you?" I said, "when you are not a hat and a hint." He considered honesty, then set it down between us like bread. "We mind the city's softer edges," he said. "We speak in polite rooms to keep knives out of impolite ones. We keep lists. We tear up lists. We pay in small favors and the occasional warning. We are not priests." A pause. "We are not the men with batons." "And you found me how?" "We keep a ledger of people who make different kinds of mistakes." He inclined his head at the coin. "You have a talent for the harmless sort. For now, For now, I repeated. What do you want in exchange for not being the men with batons? News, he said, not apologizing. If you feel your coin hum in a way you can't name, you come tell me or someone I point at. You don't try to fix it by inventing a rule that outgrows your boots. In return, we warn you if a hammer is about to mistake your head for a nail. Occasionally, we keep hammers busy elsewhere. He poured water into the cups and didn't ask whether I took sugar. And once, he added quietly, we let you say no to a thing that would have said no to you afterward with interest. He pushed a cup across. It sat down in front of me with the exhausted dignity of old china. The steam smelled like a roof just after rain. One question, he said, for the debt you owe me from the warehouse. You promised. I did, I said, surprised that the word tasted clean. Ask. He did not ask the question I feared. How did you know to stay out at Mill Lane? He said instead, as if confirming a note in a margin. A friend with careful handwriting advised me, I said. And you suggested of you. He accepted that with a small nod as if he'd heard a child recite a lesson without improvisation. Good. Keep friends who can write. Keep views. He glanced at my pocket where the coin had resumed pretending to be unremarkable. And keep that out of lodgings you don't trust. You think my room isn't rustworthy? I think rooms listen harder when people are tired. His mouth barely smiled. Forgetful listeners are worse than attentive ones. We talked around names the way dancers avoid furniture. He did not ask for the whole. I did not volunteer it. He gave me 3 places I could go if the coin grew hot for the wrong reason. The back pew of a church where the pastor's voice missed sometimes on purpose, a pipe-minus works office with a window that's stuck on humid days, a baker's yard where the dog is mean to everyone and therefore fair. Don't say my name, he said, because he hadn't given it. Say a question out loud and leave. We will find you if the question is decent. What is a decent question? One that can be answered without making the city smaller. He put his hat back on with the resigned grace of a man returning to the weather. Go home, he said. Goods night. Goods night? The night after a raid ring, he said, as if it were obvious. The city sells whatever it didn't break. Downstairs, the tailor's dummies watched me think I fooled them by not looking back. The bell didn't ring, it remembered it had already. On the street, the air tasted relieved. Rain had negotiated a cease-minus-fire. A woman haggled with her own conscience about buying a scarf she couldn't afford because the color made some shadow of a former self feel seen. I walked home without inventing an enemy from footsteps that happened to agree with mine. Benson had fallen asleep with a book across his chest, the way men do who have tried to tame the day using sentences. Melissa had tucked a note under my cup. Take all by Thursday, do not let the cat in if the heater sputters. Thump it once where the pipe pretends to be polite. I slept in pieces and woke in tired. The city filled the next days with errands and the habit of survival. Work at the warehouse taught me that ledgers lie less when they're tired. The men at the lamppost discovered a new project. The bakery woman miscounted change in my favor, did the mistake with a flourish that made the coin feel earned. I bought potatoes that promised nothing and kept it. At night, the hall taught small lessons. Justice brought a situation that had been wrapped in charity and tied with string. The kind of philanthropy that builds a school with a door too narrow for certain children. We widened the door by moving the dedication to a different wall. The hanged man rehearsed a negotiation with a ship owner who believed salt makes men obedient. We built him sentences that tasted like prophets and kept teeth out of him. I learned to spend the fog in spoonfuls. On the 3rd night after the raid ring, the coin warmed in the market as if a pocket sun had negotiated an hour's leave. I wasn't near a tent or a pump or any of the places where men set up their temporary convictions. I was beside a cart that's old lengths of ribbon to people who need help naming their belongings. The warmth wasn't alarm, it was attention. Like being addressed by name in a crowd. Excuse me, a voice said, a woman's voice that had been taught to sound smaller than its thoughts. Do you know where a person might purchase luck that doesn't leave a stain? I turned. She might have been 20, and she might have been older in the way paper is older when it's been folded and unfolded and carried around for the sake of one line written there. Her gloves had been mended with neat gratitude. She wore an expression I recognized from mirrors. The face of someone who has recently decided not to surrender. I sell ribbon, I said, because the cart deserved to be visible. But I can answer a question if it doesn't require me to lie. She glanced past me at the alley where reflections collect. It's about a house where I work, she said softly. Not a bad house. Just a house that has grown used to certain arguments sending a certain way. The mistress holds a circle on Thursdays. Harmless, she says. Tea, a little Latin, no one invited who can afford to be offended. But the staff break dishes on Fridays and cry in the scullery for no reason. She folded her fingers together so they would stop telling on her heart. I think the circle borrows more than it returns. The coin agreed by warming the space between one word and the next. Address? I asked, because that's a decent question that makes a city no smaller, only more exact. She named a street that had money at one end and old mistakes at the other. Can you help without bringing men who would make everything worse in a tidy way? I can look, I said. And if I can't, I can introduce a question to people who know how to answer without breaking the furniture. I made her a promise I could keep. We won't take any names. We will leave if we are asked. She nodded, which is what hope does before it formulates terms. Thursday at 8, she said. They like large clocks. That night, the hall listened to the problem as if it had been designed for it. Just as understood the shape before I finished describing the room. T, she said. Script. A hostess who treats history like costume jewelry. A guest who believes the world owes her a whisper. She sketched with her hands. It's not the Latin. It's the attention. The wrong kind given too carefully. They're amplifying each other like mirrors in a badly arranged hall. The hanged man suggested the kind of solution that makes sailors unpopular in parlors. We grinned and declined. Small stone, I said. We'll think twice. We rehearsed the movement until it felt like etiquette. We would not stop anyone from pretending to be braver than they were. We would simply move a chair 3 inches and open a window that had forgotten it was designed to open. A draft is a decent argument when people have mistaken their heat for holiness. Thursday arrived dressed as a party. The house wore its wealth the way some women wear pearls, as if apologizing for nothing and therefore forgiven. A maid with a pinched mouth let me in through the staircase that doesn't think of itself as a staircase in the young woman from the market. The seamstress, it turned out, and a good one because her seams confessed nothing, guided me to a side room where the staff keep baskets and stories. Don't be a hero, she said. Half minus plea, half minus order. Just her hand shaped a small adjustment in the air. Be a hinge. Hinges I could do. From the doorway, I could see the parlor's geometry. A table, not as honest as my bronze one, but crowd enough, a circle of chairs set with the kind of accuracy that advertises inexperience, a mantel clock that had made up its mind to be heard, a hostess whose warmth could heat a room and occasionally scorch it. She welcomed guests the way a conductor counts a barry. Someone uncorked a small bottle of something that wasn't wine but had learned wine's mannerisms. The Latin had been shaved of its difficulty and left as a suggestion. The coin in my pocket warmed to the polite side of warning. I walked the long way around the parlor looking for the bathroom, which is a sentence that is allowed to enter any room in any city and leave without being questioned. On my way, I nudged a chair a fraction, unless I had imagined it. I found a window latch that asked to remember and helped it. The curtain sighed at being given back a job. The circle began in a key that would have been funny if it hadn't owned sharp edges. The first prayer was more hunger than grammar. I saw it in the way the hostess's fingers curled on the tabletop the way a child's curl when a story reaches for a dragon. The second prayer was more memory than language. The third didn't happen the way they wanted. Drafts can be very eloquent. The curtain moved. The clock stumbled on a beat. One of the guests laughed at the wrong moment, heard herself, blushed, and forgot the next word. That was enough. The coin cooled as if a hand had left a brow. Replaced the bottle with tea in the quiet way servants save evenings. The hostess declared success, because failure would be inelegant, and suggested charades. One of the guests relieved a maid of a platter without learning her name. The seamstress let me out the way she had let me in, passing me a knot folded very small and tied with thread. In the alley, the listener found me as if we had chosen the same coincidence. He looked at my pockets, found nothing visible, and allowed himself to be pleased. Good hinge, he said. You know about the house, I said neutrally. We know about most rooms where tea is poured in Latin, he said. If we walk in, they lock the windows forever. Why didn't you write the note this time? Because you were asked, he said. Then, more gently, and because you should be asked, sometimes. He tilted his head, listening to news the city had decided to tell him first. You're going to have a visitor, he said. Don't make tea. It won't help. He was wrong about the tea, but only because brewing keeps hands honest. At home, Benson had rearranged the books to be taller and looked embarrassed by it. Melissa had fallen in love with a gear she couldn't afford and drew it from memory on the back of an envelope until it fit. The visitor arrived when decent people are deciding whether to forgive the day. A knock, firm but not theatrical. I opened the door with the revolver in the drawer and the coin against my palm. He wore an overcoat that apologized for the weather and a face that had practiced neutrality until a habit. Not a priest, not a bidon, something in between. Someone who has learned to say, I'm only here to listen and occasionally mean it. Evening, he said. We keep getting your handwriting without your name. Do you? I said mildly. What does it say? That you dislike bad circles, prefer windows 2 doors when possible, and make ledgers tell the truth by shaming them. He didn't smile. He had the kind of mouth that saves smiles for children in funerals. May I step in? He would step in whether or not. I held the door open enough to be hospitable and not enough to be surrendered. Family, I said, nodding toward the kitchen where the sound of 2 people pretending not to listen was doing its patient work. I won't stay. He glanced at the coin in my hand and the way my fingers had palmed it without learning the trick from anyone alive. We'll call you the fool, he said, and the room altered itself a little to admit the name. He didn't notice the alteration. He noticed me not noticing him notice. What will you call yourself? I asked. Accountant, he said dryly. Bring your coin and your decency to this address tomorrow morning. If you don't come, I'll assume you're dead or worse, and I dislike paperwork. He left me a card that refused to feel like a threat. After he went, the room exhaled a worry it had been holding since the knock. Benson breathed and pretended he hadn't been holding his breath. Melissa held up the gear drawing and asked if heaven uses teeth like these. If it's efficient, I said. She made a face that suggested heaven should hire her. I slept badly, which is another word for lightly. Dawn was not a surprise, but a negotiation. I washed, counted coins, pocketed the coin that didn't count, and walked to the address as if I had places to be no one else wanted. The building had been a warehouse before it learned to do arithmetic. Inside, desks that held their breath, men and women who wrote on paper, as if saving lives were a matter of penmanship, a map with pins in it that could have been a constellation or a disease. The accountant met me with a nod that valued punctuality over charm. We don't need to know where your door is, he said, declining to write the word. We need to know. You won't open it in a crowded room just to see who falls out. That would be impolite, I said. It would be expensive, he corrected. These are the rules if you want to walk around without introducing yourself to men who think everyone is a nail. He recited them without fanfare. Don't promise what the fog would refuse. Don't take payment in names. Don't make bargains you can't honor without asking the door to pick sides. If you feel watched, you or act accordingly. If someone asks you to choose between your family and a principle, choose your family and come tell us the principle so we can break it properly. And in return, I asked. We'll move a patrol route, he said. We'll stall a warrant until sense catches up. We'll tell you when a house you pass on Thursdays is pretending to be a church. Sometimes we will ask you to stand in a door and keep both sides from believing they are the only one. It was a fair offer because it could be withdrawn. I signed nothing. He asked for nothing I could not afford. He did not ask me to betray a hall that didn't belong to me. He did not ask me to trust him. He asked me to be useful at a speed that kept me alive. Do we have an arrangement? He said, cool, hovering as if the air were the paper. We have an arrangement, I said, and felt the coin warm the way metal does when it decides to belong to a hand. When I left, the city looked the same, which is the precise effect of a decision that will alter it. That night in the hall, I told them some truth. Not all enough. The hanged man grunted the way ships approve the weather. Just a sliss, and as if she were measuring a seam and deciding whether it would hold. We'll keep our circle clean, I said. We'll keep our chairs where they cannot be tripped over by people who mean well with bad odds. And if a listener listens, we give him nothing worth gossiping about. What do we call this rule? Just a sassed, smiling a little. Hospitality, I said. For ourselves first. The fog like that. It folded and contented the way a library is contented when everyone has chosen a book heavy enough to keep. We sat with our hands visible and our bargains small. On my way out, the coin warmed once, sharply, a memory cut quick across my mind. Mere a bruise, a hand that had not been mine closing around a trigger. The shock left without apologizing. Names were aid or I was not ready to open, but I knew which hall would be waiting when I was. The first week after the arrangement tasted like safety brewed weekly. Nothing spilled, nothing broke where anyone could see. When the city is quiet, it is because someone is paying for the silence. The accountant's office sent me a small errand disguised as a courtesy. Walk past a bathish that was pretending to be a school and nod if the coin became uncomfortable. It didn't. The bathish steamed politely the boys invented rules in the yard that had nothing to do with law books. I nodded anyway, because men in offices need proof they can be obeyed without offense. At home, Melissa delivered a speech to the heater about ambition and precise tolerances. The heater behaved better afterward. She showed me a handbill. Miller Crest, Precision Works, a print as wanted. The salary was an insult, the machines in the illustration were not. I can pass any practical exam, she said, wiping her hands on a rag and leaving a constellation of oil on her cheek. The question is whether they believe that before or after I do the work for free. Then don't give them free, I said. Give them one problem solved at their table with their tools and your name on the paper. She nodded as if I had given her a gear instead of advice. Benson promised to accompany her to the foundry, which is the brothers' version of prayer. That night, the hall held its breath the way rooms do before a new rule learns its name. I laid out 3 small problems like cards. The hanged man pushed the first back with 2 fingers. Too dirty to fix without becoming it. Just escaped the second and turned it until it clicked. A donation would be rooted around a parasite simply by demanding a receipt. The parasite could not sign. The third problem had my name in it, faint but legible. The mirror and the bullet. I want to buy a piece of the moment I lost, I said. Not all of it. Just the second between choice and consequence. The fog weighed the request with the gravity of a librarian confronted by a request for a book that bites. What will you pay? The hangman asked gently, which is how you know a price will not be counted in coins. A memory I do not need, I said, and felt the lie inside the sentence try to sit up. A small one, just as his gaze softened without losing its edge. A color, perhaps, she suggested. Or the precise way a hallway sounds when your sister laughs 2 rooms away. I swallowed. The fog approves men who know when to be afraid of ordinary things. A color? I said. A foolish color. Something that will only embarrass me when I get it wrong. The hall accepted the terms. The bronze table warmed, then cooled as if the decision had been hammered thin and left to rest. Ask mine is plain, I told myself, steadied my breath, and spoke to the gray. Show me what my eyes knew and my mind refused. Light bent. Not much. Just enough for the mirror to remember. I saw a pane, not the one in my room. The glass was older, the silver worn in a way that makes faces pious. A hand lifted in the reflection. A hand wearing my skin. And then another hand reached into the frame from a place that was not my side of the glass. The second hand smelled faintly of cloves, and cola cuff snagged on a nail head a watch tick 1 rhythm slower than mine. The world tilted left exactly the width of a crooked floorboard. Then the light straight, and I was back at the table with the taste of iron and the sound of 1 watch too many. What did you pay? The hanged man asked quietly. The color of the bakery awning, I said, and the sentence felt like dropping a coin into a well and listening for a splash that refuses. Then tomorrow you will call it wrong, just as said, and her kindness made the rule official. Name? The hangman asked of the thing we had just done. Tithe, I said. Never more than we can carry. Never less than we owe. The fog approved. I left with the outline of a hand that wasn't mine etched into a nerve. In the morning, the bakery woman handed me bread wrapped in paper that had held someone else's sweet ones. Lucky you came early, she said. Sugar went up at noon. Thank you, I said, glancing up at her green awning. She frowned pleasantly. It's red, dear. Of course, I said, heart hitching at the price settling into place. She sliced me an extra heel to make up for the way my face must have shown the arithmetic. Melissa's exam at Millercrest was set for Saturday. She practiced on scrap metal and an old clock whose ticks tried to lie. Bence uncoached by holding the door against interruptions and frowning at physics until physics apologized. I sharpened pencils and shut my mouth because confidence on loan is better than the finest speech. In the market, the seamstress from the Thursday house found me between stalls selling respectable vices. They laughed at themselves on Friday, she said, smiling with her eyes. The staff didn't cry. Something shifted and forgot to shift back. Good, I said. May I keep forgetting? The coin warmed once, briefly, as a man with a newspaper folded to the crime page walked by and decided not to follow a lady into an alley. I let the warmth pass through me without taking credit for the city's rare good sense. That evening, the listener collected me with a nod that passed for urgency. Small hinge, he said. Third dock, warehouse with the broken gutter. We're not moving ships, we're moving a fuse. Whose? The kind that can't be returned once purchased. He looked at my hands. You won't touch it. You'll hold a conversation at the right time with the wrong man and let it end 1 sentence earlier than it wants. The dock wore its usual argument of ropes and curses. The warehouse in question had a gutter that drooled rust and a padlock that had chosen not to be brave. Inside, men had arranged crates in rows that would give any fire ambition. A foreman with a clean collar and a dishonest belt supervised the illusion of order. The wrong man. My part in the play. Watched the door with the itch of someone who has promised his boss he will produce an event by midnight. Cold night, I said, stopping beside him as if the view deserved 2 opinions. He grunted. The gesture meant watch with me. I obeyed. Ever notice how smoke from river fog sticks to a building? I asked, nodding toward the broken gutter. Eats the paint, then the wood. Looks like nothing until it's history. He followed my nod because men follow nods when they do not want to follow orders. Paint's cheap, he said. Sure, I agreed. Wood isn't, and sailors remember which warehouse burned and which didn't. Even drunks can keep that list. He adjusted his hat, which is a nervous man's version of moving a chair. You from the insurance? From the city's future, I said lightly. It gets nervous when people stack inling indoors. He laughed, despite himself. Then he stopped, because laughing loosens important muscles. You a priest? He asked, trying to put me in a drawer. Accountant, I said, and let the word do what it had learned to do. Somewhere behind us, the listener misdirected a man with a fuse by asking him to help count crates. By the time the count failed and the man remembered his errand had dissolved under supervision. The wrong man cupped a match and found no place to put it that wouldn't explain him to a judge. Long night, he muttered. Not worth the story it would make. He pocketed the match whole, which is how knights are saved without angels. We left the warehouse smelling of rope and missed chances. The listener tipped his hat at my silence. Sometimes it's enough, he said. It will have to be, I said. Until it isn't. Saturday arrived carrying a foundry's breath. Miller crest war order like a badge. The foreman's mustache had been groomed with the faith of a man who believes symmetry prevents accidents. Melissa stood before a bench the way generals stand before maps, more interested in the terrain than in who owns it. The test was a valve assembly, simple in pictures and impolite in practice. Her hands moved with the respecting patience has for precision. She finished, wiped the oil off her fingers without wiping away pride, and presented the result like proof. The master machinist looked for the mistake he could afford to forgive. He found none. He looked for the one he would have to name. He found a choice instead. We don't have a ladies' lavatory, he said, because men in rooms like this have to declare their own inadequacies before anyone else does. Then you'll need one, Melissa said calmly, which made Benson cover his smile with a cough. The machinist blinked, surprised by not being annoyed. Report Monday, he said, giving her the apology he could afford. The nod. We ate to that night, thin but ambitious. The coin lay on the table like a pet asleep. When it warmed suddenly, it did so with the urgency of a bell you hear in your bones. The listener's card had 3 addresses on it. I chose the Pipe Minus Works office because the window there sticks and the desk clerk owes nobody anything. Trouble, I said to the ear and left without being dramatic. He met me 2 corners later, already moving. Which way did the warmth lean? He asked. North, I said, surprised by my own certainty. The kind of north that shortens streets. Church, he said. Not the pastor's. The other one. The other church had taken over a warehouse because faith appreciates ceiling height and acoustics. Men with reasonable hats guarded the door by pretending to be lost. Inside, not minus priest, smoothed chairs and syllables with equal care. The coin heated like a whispered argument. I kept my hands out and my mouth empty. We found the edge of the circle by listening for the breath of people who have decided to be brave on furniture. The ritual was not wicked. Wickedness is louder and less polite. This was hungry and tidy. It wanted to relocate a sorrow from one woman to a room so the room could carry it like a stain. They had even written rules to ensure no one would see the stain when the light was kind. Small stone, I said under my breath. The listener nodded. We opened a window high and mean, the kind that vents lies. I stepped into a side aisle and shifted a chair 3 inches so a draft could speak in a vocabulary only curtains understand. The sorrow reconsidered public life and agreed to visit smaller. The woman breathed, the way people breathe when they discover they have not been volunteered for a sacrifice. After, a not minus priest intercepted me with a smile like a bandage. You have a way with doors, he said. We need men who own hinges. I rent mine by the hour, I said. He took that as refusal and still liked me. On my way home, I bought a paper. The front page had room for a fire that hadn't happened. The line where it would have been fitted different story neatly. We don't get credit for disasters that fail to occur. That is decent. The careful handwriting returned the next day, folded into a library book I had not checked out. We speak now, it said. Bring the coin. Come alone. The address was the reading room under the old museum, the one with a ceiling that remembers ships. I went because the difference between bravery and curiosity is paperwork. The reading room smelled like paper that has learned to keep a secret. A woman with iron minus gray hair sat at a table with 4 chairs, in the silence of someone who intends not to apologize for occupying space. She wore no rings and a gaze that had priced everything and chosen modesty as a luxury. Beside her sat a man whose spectacles had studied law before he did. They were drinking nothing, which is how serious people save time. You drew a circle without falling in, she said without greeting. Good. Most men make a mess, blame them up, and call it theology. I read instructions, I said. Rare, she said, pleased. She inclined her head at the coin. You keep it? I do. You don't lend it? I don't. Her smile conceded a point rather than a victory. Wise. Tools become opinions when they travel. We keep a list of men who can be trusted with listening pieces. We add names slowly. We have 2 rules. 1. Never listen where someone already whispers. 2. Return what you learn in a form that does not humiliate anyone who didn't ask to be educated. And what do you want from me? A demonstration, she said. We have a phrase we cannot parse. The coin will know whether it is grammar or hunger. She slid a slip across the table with the tips of her fingers. 5 tidy words stared up at me. They were nothing by themselves and everything in the mouth that had spoken them. I held the coin and read the phrase aloud in a whisper that wouldn't wake shells. The coin cooled. Grammar, I said. An address that pretends to be a sentence. Good, she said. Then we can knock at the right door and bring a dictionary instead of a cudgel. She pronounced the final word with an accent sharpened by years of being expected to swallow them. We aren't a society, the man with spectacles added helpfully. We are a habit. We meet on Tuesdays. We remind each other not to become the problem we would like to solve. Bring nothing you aren't willing to lose, she said, softer now. And bring a question that makes a room larger. I left with no certificate, which is how you know you've been talking to responsible people. The coin rode quiet. Outside, the rain had decided to stay mild enough to be endured and sharp enough to be noticed. At home, Melissa held up her acceptance slip like a trophy she had not needed to steal. Monday, she said, eyes brightened, unafraid. I will bring my own rag. Benson had acquired a scrape that looked like the city's handwriting on the back of his hand. Stare, he said. 1. We laughed and reshuffled our bills so that the cruel ones were at the bottom. Then the coin warmed with a suddenness that made breath an option. The accountant's office this time. A runner met me under a gaslight that hissed its opinion. He says now, the boy panted. Not after tea. The office had grown an extra map while I wasn't looking. The pins crowded 1 quarter like a rash. The accountant pointed with his pen. A procession, he said. The kind that pretends to be a walk and is actually a net. We're short to men who can be boring in the right place. I am overqualified, I said. You'll stand at the corner of Market and Bishop, he said. If the coin warms you on, then you tie your shoe. Then you drop your hat. If it's still warm, you walk away, slowly. If you run, they win. And if it stays cold, you watch, he said. And you forget what you saw in case someone asks. Market and Bishop owned the evening. A crowd walked with that specific politeness men use when they want to occupy a street and not a cell. Flags behaved themselves and borrowed its meter from a train. The coin rested cool enough to pass inspection. Beyond any way to confirm my face still belonged to me. Halfway through the hymn, 2 men stepped from a doorway with a banner to new 2 belonged to their cause. The coin warmed. Not hot, but aware. I tied my shoe and discovered how long laces can be. The men hesitated. A patrol rounded the far corner without noticing they had prevented something. The men decided to fold their banner without admitting to themselves why. The hymn concluded with a decent cadence. I dropped my hat for the practice. No one clapped. The listener found me after by letting the city introduce him with a draft. Still alive? He asked. Still boring, I said. Good. He touched the brim of his hat toward the block where nothing had happened. The best days end like that. Back in the hall, the bronze table wore another fleck. Pilot left as punctuation. The hanged man reported that his crewman's mother had received a basket from a gentleman who did not sign his name. Justice explained a legal sentence that had been taught a conscience by moving its comma. We named 2 rules and discarded a 3rd because it tasted like vanity. Your door, the hanged man said at last, looking at me the way sailors look at horizons. Do you trust it? I don't trust doors, I said. I trust terms. And the terms? Hope, I said. For now. Just to snap the fingertip against the table where the fleck glinted. Then let's hold until holding becomes something else. I left the hall into a night that smelled of iron and new promises. On the stair, the landlord's cat resumed his position on the 3rd step, magnanimous in victory. Under my door lay no note. That was either permission or a test. In the morning, while Benson practiced being older and Melissa practiced being inevitable, I tried the mirror again. I expected nothing. The mirror remembered nothing it was willing to share. That is how ordinary life reminds you it has claims you cannot pay in full. I bought bread and did not guess the color of the awning out loud. By noon, a boy from the accountant's office appeared with a note folded into the shape of a wedge. Tomorrow, The procession again different him, same corner, on the back. In smaller letters, a courtesy from the listener. Bring no coin. Bring only your pockets. That evening, the reading room welcomed me like a rule spoken softly. The iron-gray woman passed me a list of words that wanted translation into decency. We translated 2 and set fire to 1. Not everything deserves rescuing, she said, and the shelves nodded. On my way out, I ran into the sailor in a place where sailors don't usually visit. The quiet street by the watchmakers, where time admits to being a habit. He looked at the window the way men look at the sea when it is inland. You'll have to choose, he said, not unkindly. Between what and what? Between finding the man with the clove-smelling cuff, he said, and making sure your sister's lavatory at the works has a door that locks. Why not both? Because one of them has a schedule, he said, and the other has a memory. He was right. He was always right when he decided to be. I watched the watchmakers apprentice oil a gear that would never know our names. I went home and sharpened a pencil for Melissa and decided that the man with clothes could live one more day under a borrowed sky. Tomorrow's hymn would arrive on time. So would I. The hymn they chose the next day had a march in its bones and an apology in its refrain. I left the coin at home the way one leaves a candle and lit on purpose. Pockets only, the note had said. I emptied them of everything but the habit of being useful. Market and Bishop again with a different crowd but the same decision. Phyllis Treat without turning it into a story a court could enjoy later. People walked as if they had all agreed to the same sentence and were working out where to put the comma. Flags behaved, faces watched themselves, the air kept account. A boy with a hairline par to tidy for his age threaded sideways through the bodies, distributing folded papers that pretended to be directions to nowhere. I let one land in my palm and felt nothing more dangerous than ink practicing its consonants. A pair of men stood by a doorway, too clean for the street and too bored to be innocent. Their banner was folded tight the way a secret, it's clenched in a fist. Ugh, I told my face and it complied. I tied my shoe because shoelaces are polite accomplices. I let myself drift as if my interests had been loosened by weather. Near the banner minus men, a third figure waited with the patience of someone whose evening requires only one success. He held nothing visible. He held a plan and a pocket. He brushed against my shoulder carefully, the kind of careful that calls itself accident after it has practiced. A weight appeared in my right pocket, brief as a handshake. I did not look. I learned its size with the skin of my thigh. A packet no bigger than a matchbox, too light to be money, too heavy to be paper. The men with the banner shifted, ready to be outraged on cue when their cue found a home. Drop your head, the accountant had said. I did, letting the brim kiss the cobbles near the gutter. I crouched as if embarrassed by clumsiness and used the crouch to turn my pockets inside out. Both. Like a poor man proving an argument, the packet fell into my hat's crown and made a private sound. I righted the hat with the packet, now its lining, and drifted on, hat in hand, pockets honest as bone. Behind me, a hand reached for outrage and found only certainty of being ignored. The hymn's last verse swallowed their prepared shout. The banner never opened. The crowd remained a street, not evidence. The boy with a tidy part vanished the way messengers do when their message fails to grow legs. 2 corners on, I let the hat settle on my head again and walked toward a yard with a dog mean to everyone. Inside, where the kitchener forgot to latch, sat a bin of damp rags headed for washing. The packet went under the 3rd rag from the top. The waylaw goes under a truth when it knows it will never be found if it minds its mares. I left with my pockets returned to their habit. At the next corner, a smell found me the way some phrases do. Clove and coal and the memory of a watch that keeps a slower time. A glove brushed my sleeve. I turned, ready for a hand that knew my pockets, and found a cuff snag by the same careless nail minus head I had seen in the mirror's memory. The thread pulled tight, the fabric insisting on its own stitch. He kept walking without apology, confident in the way men are when their shoes have learned it to go first. He turned into the kind of alley that insists it is a passage. I did not follow. I had been told what the wrong price was. The listener lifted a brow at me later in the office that pretends not to be an office. Good pockets, he said. Good hats, I said, because I had discovered a new respect for brims. The accountant marked nothing on a paper and still recorded what mattered. There will be less patrolling tonight, he said, not smiling, which means more foolishness in other streets. We will spend our boredom there. At home, Benson found humor in the way my hat had learned it to be a drawer. Melissa held up a proper latch she had purchased without asking permission from anyone who might pretend she needed it. How much, I asked. For the door you intend to civilize? 3 small coins and the kind of face that forbids commentary, she said. I will borrow the drill from the neighbor who over soils his machine. Take him a pie, I suggested. We can afford pies now? Benson asked. We can't afford a crust, I said. Fill it with pride. He laughed, and Pride agreed to be a pie. That night, the hall waited with the kind of silence that enjoys company. The hanged man listened to the hat story with the private pleasure of sailors, who appreciate pockets as a craft. Just to snap the table with the nail of one finger, thinking, name the rule, she said at last, smiling a little. Empty minus hand oath, I said. If a crowd must remain a crowd, carry only what you can rob without changing anyone's life. The fog folded in approval, and the bronze kept a new fleck as if punctuation were a currency. We worked small cases until the candle shortened. Justice showed how a single verb could be bent until a bill said mercy and meant delay. The hanged man rehearsed an apology that would extract the battered sailor from a debt without bleeding the man who had loaned him fish and worry. I held in my mouth the taste of clove and iron and chose not to swallow it. Morning, Melissa left in a coat that had been brushed with more hope than fabric. Benson escorted her through the foundry gate as if he were late for a bruise. I walked the long way round to the market, just in case. The bakery woman handed me bread wrapped in yesterday's news and didn't ask why I never called her rotting by its color anymore. That is the kind of mercy the city sells for free. At Miller Crest, they had decided to be reasonable for a day. The master machinist set Melissa 3 tasks that would have insulted her had he not been watching to see whether she would be offended. She finished them in half the time allotted, then asked for a rag and cleaned the lathe until it confessed what it had been doing wrong. By noon, someone was sent to buy a lock that could be installed on a door that had previously trusted in custom. Bring 2, Melissa said, and the man obeyed because he heard a foreman's tone and forgot the pitch belonged to a woman. I stood in the yard a moment to enjoy the sound of common sense hammered into hinges. That's when the clove reached me clean, without cold to argue for it. I followed the scent to the edge of the street and saw a man in a coat too dark for this hour stand at a corner long enough to prove he wasn't lost. He raised his hand to check a watch that ticked a fraction slow, and the cuff flicked back to show a button with a stamp like a crest. 2 letters, interlocked by a taste for symmetry. For a scandalous second, both decisions leaned forward to be chosen. Find him or walk back to the yard and carry the second lock in with a joke that would become policy. I obeyed the hanged man in my head. I took the lock. Inside, Melissa measured the door twice and drilled once. The foreman complained theatrically about sawdust on his boots and then stood guard with Pride's relief while she set the plate, positioned the tongue, tested the key, and made a note about the slop in the hinge that she would correct after lunch with a washer worth 2 pennies and a curse worth none. When she finished, the room performed the human version of clapping. It breathed and remembered not to stare. You'll hate Tuesdays, she said to me under her breath as men pretended not to eavesdrop. They keep inventing committees to watch me work. Committees tire, I said. Locks endure. After I told the listener that the cuff had worn a crest. He did not ask which letters. He watched my face and found them there anyway. You'll see those letters in the city more now that you've noticed them, he said. That is not the same as doom. What should I do when I see them again? Choose what you're already choosing, he said. Family first, then principle if it can be returned undented. In the hall that night, I asked the fog a question that fit inside the rules without tearing them. If I am offered a name before I can afford it, make my tongue heavy. If I am offered a choice I can afford, make my feet quick. The fog approved. These little coward assess that pretend to be wisdom. Justice drew a circle on the table with her fingertip and did not finish it, to remind us that not all circles deserve completion. Under my door later lay a note from a different hand. Thick strokes, impatient with pens. Stop digging in clocks, it said. You'll find teeth. I folded the paper twice and set it beside the 3 polite ones. The stack made a small geography of manners. The cat on the 3rd step refused to comment. The next day required errands with honest receipts. I carried forms from the accountant's office to a desk that stamps things for a living and learned that the woman with the stamp knew more about the city than anyone who believes themselves important. I brought her a sweet troll in exchange for a rumor. A watchmaker near the river who buys cuff buttons and doesn't ask why they smell of cloves. Men with slow watches favor him, she said. He claims slower time lasts longer. I went at dusk. His window glowed like certainty. Inside, small mechanisms admitted defeat under magnification and then agreed to improve. He adjusted a mainspring with the tenderness of a father who has learned not to instruct so much as listen. I asked about buttons like the one I had seen. He looked at my hands, decided I wasn't a thief, and tipped out a drawer of little trophies men forget to miss. Brass, own. Mother minus of minus pearl to stamped with MC in a fashion too proud to be tasteful. Factory gift, he said. They hand them out to men who shake hands for a living. Loss is common. Pride is heavier than thread. Clothes? I asked, casual as a man choosing a ribbon. Seasonal, he said without looking up. The workers down river chew it for the smell. Covers the cold. Or so they say. He did not ask why I wanted to know. He had been paid in the only currency he accepted. Time wasted in his shop admiring the patience of cogs. I walked home with the slow minus watch tick lingering in my ear and the scent of cloves promoted from metaphor to map. On the stair, a voice from above said my name the way a memory says it when it wants rent. I looked up and into the face from the mirror, not mine but wearing my outline. A man near my age, less hungry in the jaw, more certain in the eyes. His coat carried a ghost of cold. His cuff held, for once, where cloth and wool agreed. You took my place, he said mildly, as if stating the price of flour. I woke up in a room, I answered, because it was a sentence that contained both truths and lies in equal portions. He looked at the third step and smiled at the cat as if acknowledging a mutual professional. You owe me a bullet, he said, or a favor worth more. The corridor narrowed to a sentence with too few commas. The rules in my pocket organized themselves and failed to volunteer. I did not reach for the drawer with the revolver. I did not reach for anything. Pockets only, the note had said. The man in my outline waited with more patience than I could afford to learn. What would satisfy you? I asked, because that is a decent question even when it is a coward's. Nothing you can pay tonight, he said. But you can begin by pouring tea and listening while I tell you who you are. He said it without malice or mirth, the way a notary reads a document into a room. I stepped aside. Hospitality, the rule insisted. For ourselves first. But sometimes for the storm if you want the roof to remember you kindly. We sat at the table with the 3 polite notes and the one that bit. He did not touch them. He touched the cup and watched steam right on air. He told the beginning of a story in which a hand reached through a mirror and a watch ticked 1 heartbeat slow. It was a story I already owned, recited by a voice that walked on streets my souls recognized. When he reached the part with the smell of cloves, I finished the sentence. He nodded as if we had both remembered a song we resented knowing. We did not finish the pot. He stood, thanked the room, and said he would return when my pockets were heavier. Bring nothing, I said to my own fear after the door shut. Bring only your pockets. The cat on the third step opened one eye as if to say he had always expected it to end this way. In the hall that night, the bronze table felt warmer before my hand found it. Justice arrived with a look that asked whether my face had been changed by a sentence. The hanged man listened the way men listen when rigging will have to be cut. I told him the smallest amount of truth that could carry weight without debt. Name this. Justice said at last, almost kind. This rule that says you must sit with your reflection when it knocks. Nearer do, I said. Paid in listening. Collected in pieces. The fog absorbed the phrase and did not return it. That meant the debt was real. I left early, before the candle remembered courage. The city was not asleep so much as pretending. Pockets only, I told myself again, turning the phrase over until it lost its edges. In the drawer, the revolver lay like a history book whose last pages someone had glued shut. I washed my face. The mirror offered the same borrowed certainty it had offered the night I woke. For a breath that was not quite a breath, the second hand somewhere ticked slow. Then time agreed to argue later. On the table, the stack of notes weighted like a skyline. I wrote nothing below them. Tomorrow would bring its own punctuation. Morning took inventory of the table the way landlords take inventory of rooms. Impersonally, efficiently, without love. 3 polite notes, 1 that bit, 2 cups left to shame, and a coin that pretended to be asleep. Benson left early to escort Melissa through a gauntlet of men who would swear they were merely arriving at work. I swept chalk dust into a small hill and flat, and it with my palm. The city accepts such rituals as payment for nothing in particular. The day asked for errands. The accountant's office required a signature from a clerk who refuses to sign unless the pen pleases him. I brought him the pen and saved us both a speech. A woman at the stamp desk taught me the rumor of a warehouse staircase that skims to steps when no one is watching. Good to know if one day I must arrive sooner than I can. The listener intercepted me at the corner where the lamppost leans like a tired officer and handed me a folded map of the river quarter. Keep this in your head, he said. Not your pocket. Because pockets talk? Because pockets get borrowed. His gaze flicked toward my coat with its honest lining. We have a small hinge tonight. Bread and steam. You'll hate it, which means you're qualified. Bread and steam meant the soup kitchen near the pipes where men leave their names on benches. Not wickedness. Only a habit of transforming mercy into a funnel. A foreman with clean fingernails had arranged for the line to cross it, or that would be locked when it suited a speech. We crossed it. I stood where I looked like I had always stood and directed the first for men to the side, or so the pot won't burn. They believed me because my face practiced a competence I often borrowed. By the time the clean fingernails arrived with a plan crafted for a bottleneck, the street had turned into 6 small lines that refused to vote for him. Name the rule, Justice said later, approving my dislike Taryn with her eyes. Fork the cue, I said. If a man intends to count people until they resemble proof, teach the line to divide. The fog saved the phrase the way a librarian saves a mischievous book. Accessible, but not to children. At Miller Crest, Melissa returned home with the temperament of iron that has been properly cooled. Committees watched, she reported. I performed, and the lady didn't mind their eyes. She emptied her pocket of shavings and 1 gold dishwasher that had no meaningful monetary value and all the value of a trophy. They'll say I'm fast. They'll learn I'm accurate. Men can learn, Benson asked, teasing the world. Tools teach them, she said, and smiled without apology. That night, I lit the candle as if I were lighting a promise. The hall had adopted a patience I recognized from workshops, a silence that allows attention to decide where to sit. The hanged man arrived with a splinter in his thumb and the satisfaction of a man whose crew had eaten. Justice brought a phrase the law had taught her to whisper and asked the table to make it pronounceable. Before we began, I paid mirror due in advance. A little. If a memory is offered without malice. I asked the fog, let me hear only as much as won't make me a liar to my sister. Approval came as a refusal to be dramatic. Good rooms do not applaud. The hanged man's splinter wanted tweezers, not theology. We fetched them from the edge of our patience. Justice's phrase bent like a knee when the comma moved to a place that didn't make anyone kneel. I laid on the bronze the problem the listener had given me in outline, a procession that wants to become a knit again. This time their banner is in cloth. Good hats? The hanged man asked. Better pockets, I said, and men who cannot be offended into usefulness. We rehearsed boredom until it gleamed. On the way out, the fog pressed 1 thought into my palm like a coin I hadn't expected. If you must be brave at a hinge, not a wall. I kept it. Coins are not the only tools that listen. The next day misbehaved politely. The bakery woman ran out of small coins and paid me in a story about a boy who traded his good shoes for a clock that went slow on purpose to make the day last. I spent the story before noon and felt wealthier. The stamp minus desk woman stamped with a rhythm that would have set a platoon marching without realizing who lead them. I bought bread in a shade I couldn't name and pretended it was on purpose. At dusk, the listener's card sent me to a street that owns 6 doorways and the memory of 11. The procession this time did not sing, it hummed with its mouth shut. The banner was words on lips, not cloth and pole. My pockets held nothing but air and a decision to be dull, when a hand brushed mine with the precision of a locksmith. I turned my palms up to the night and displayed their emptiness with a shrug. The hand withdrew, chastened by the lack of poetry. Our little corner remained boring. Our boring saved the evening from relocating to a different kind of room. Afterward, I walked the long way home because long ways are where thoughts practice. In the watchmaker's window, a slow second hand argued with the minute and 1. The smell of cloves arrived without a coat. A man stood under a gaslight reading the back of a flyer the way some men read their past, expecting to dislike it and doing it anyway. He turned before I could pretend not to see him. We regarded each other with a politeness neither of us deserved. You found the stair with the count, he observed. It found me, I said. He nodded once to a memory we both owned. Next time, he said, bring the bullet. If you don't bring a price. I brought tea, I said. Tea pays no debts. He looked past me at a window where my reflection lived its smaller, shallower life. But I will accept a hinge. He left with the sound of a watch that thinks the river is patient. I let him go because sometimes the right price is to notice nothing and live. Back at the table, the polite notes regarded one another like neighbors who had shared too many walls. I added nothing. Sleep refused to sign, and I permitted it. Near dawn, the coin warmed a fraction without choosing an event. I stayed still. Some nights, a city turns in its sleep and expects you to pretend you are furniture. A week collected itself and spent. Melissa made the foundry change a guard's mind about women needing permission to use a wrench, by using a wrench to fix the thing that had been making his nights long. Benson acquired a bandage in a story that he assured me would be funnier in a month. I learned that the seamstress had begun refusing work from a house that served Latin with tea and now slept better for it. The stamp minus desk woman told me that the crest on the cuff buttons was not Miller Crests after all, but something older. Meridian Co., a firm that lent money to men who already had too much furniture. She said it with the disdain of a person who has learned to save the city with ink and refuses to be impressed by anyone else's flourishes. The listener offered me a job that was more courtesy than request. 2 blocks will argue tonight, he said. Each thinks they own the corner lamp. You'll stand where the light falls and be wrong politely until they both decide they were right all along. I performed wrongness with such courtesy that the quarrel discovered itself out of fashion. We named a rule later, polite error, and let it sit beside fork the cue and empty minus hand, both like cousins at a table that has learned to pass bread without speeches. The day after, my pocket found a small weight of its own accord. The coin. I hadn't placed it there. That would have frightened me once. Instead, I treated it as a city's way of saying, go on, we're listening. The weight led me to the reading room under the museum's ribs. The iron-minus gray woman had gathered 3 others who knew how to let silence carry the first 2 minutes of any useful meeting. We have a sentence that has begun to behave, she said, sliding me a scrap in her tidy hand. We want to be sure it won't misbehave in the mouth of a man who believes himself a trumpet. I read it aloud as a whisper the coin cooled. Grammar, I said. It belongs in mouths. It's the ears that are at risk. Then let's speak softly, she said, and wait until the room recognized us as furniture. On my way out, I found the watchmaker at his door, a box in his hands too small to matter and too heavy to trust. A man returned this, he said it wasn't his. He wanted it to be heavier. What is it? A minute, he said, opening the lid to reveal a disc of brass that loved being precise. Fairly made, fairly sold, unfairly judged. I bought it with 2 coins and a promise to come back with a question. He wrapped it as if protecting a child from weather. In my pocket, the coin warmed. Not jealous, only attentive. Tools like to meet one another. That night, the hall breathed a question before I sat. Are you ready to pay for names? I answered by reciting my little prayer about heavy tongues and quick feet. Just as spliced 3 slips of paper on the bronze. Seating plans, donations, a speech that wanted to learn mercy. The hanged man reported the sea in the way sailors do when the land is due bad news, but can be trusted to acquire it later. I asked for a small memory and the fog assessed my credit. Just the sound, I bargained. Not the word, not the face. The sound the watch made when the mirror learned where to break. It gave me a clip. Not loud, but final. The sound lived at the exact center between intention and accident. I stored it between my ribs where fear saves its compliments. Name the price, just as said softly. The memory of the smell of rain on coal, I said, and the bakery woman's awning remained red while a different color fell out of my mouth. Someday when I was foolish, the fog accepted the exchange and let me keep my face. On the stair, the cat moved aside without tax. Under my door, 1 note only, written by the hand that teaches pens their limitations. Tuesday, bring the brass minute. We'll teach it to behave in a sentence. I slept enough to get away with it. Dawn corrected me. The city wanted evidence of usefulness. The accountant provided it. A ledger at the almshouse that lies like a bored child, he said. We'll go over the numbers and let the truth embarrass the worst of them without closing the kitchen. We sat in a basement with potatoes and paper and taught lines to line up. The coin stayed cool, the brass minute weighed my pocket into steadiness. When we were done, 1 man left with a job that fit him and one without a task that no longer existed. The kitchen kept its soup. I went home with ink on my fingers and a decency hangover. The man with my outline returned when the kettle began to talk. He did not knock. He arrived with a cough that belonged to a train, an apology that fit no mouth. Benson sat down, a cup slightly too hard in the kitchen, and didn't move again. Melissa lifted her eyes long enough to measure the new geometry of the room and returned to her gear because work saves people more reliably than courage. You like rules, the man said, looking at the chalk that survived in cracks. Good. Rules help men who stand at doors and decide which direction is heavier. Do you want tea? I asked, hating the way politeness decorated fear. I want time, he said, gazing at the brass minute as if assessing its character. If you won't return the bullet, you'll return this. A single minute at a stare you already know, under a ring you pretend is weather. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Soon. You'll stand and you won't run and you'll listen for the click you bought. Why? I asked, because questions are a defense that buys thought. Because you took a place that had already paid, he said without heat. You were cheaper. The city likes bargains. I don't. He left the way a debt leaves. Without closing the door tightly behind him, the cat on the step flicked an ear at the draft and wrote it down. In the hall, the bronze kept my hand from shaking. The hanged man's eyes found the edge that fear cuts in a man's voice. He set a story down on the table the way good men set knives down out of reach. Justice did not ask for details. She named us a rule. Stand elsewhere, she said. When a man tries to sell you a place to die, choose a different address. It's already chosen, I said. He wants the third step under a red ring. Then bring a different minute, the hanged man said. Bring two. Spend the wrong one. We smiled, grim and grateful. The fog refused to laugh and therefore approved. The red ring returned so politely that men found courage merely by noticing how little courage the sky seemed to require. I walked to the stair that counts, the brass minute heavy in my pocket, the coin warm enough to warn and not enough to instruct. The third step waited with the patience of furniture. I stood on the fourth. The city held its breath and then let it out. The click I had purchased arrived, the sound of a watch admitting the exactness of its own defeat. On the third step, something that had meant to occur failed to recruit the required second. On the fourth, my weight argued with gravity and won. A man in a coat too dark for weather paused at the alley mouth, looked up, and did a small arithmetic. He touched his cuff, adjusted nothing, and walked on. North, the kind of north that shortens streets. I waited a full minute. I spent the brass disc by dropping it into the crack between steps where coins live like secrets. It wedged, then settled, then approved me by refusing to ring. Named the rule, just as said later when I told the hall the story without its names. Spend the wrong minute, I said. When a man sells you his schedule, bankrupted. The fog liked this one very much. In the morning, the bakery woman asked whether I'd forgotten something. I'd meant to be afraid and discovered I could not afford it. Instead, I bought 2 loaves and carried one to the stamp minus desk woman. For your ink, I said. She sniffed, decided not to be moved, and cut the loaf in half to share with a clerk who despises all pens equally. Under my door. Nothing. That counted as 2 permissions and a warning. I found the listener near the tailor shop staring at a suit that had dyed and been posed for a portrait. You chose the 4th step, he said. Good. He prefers the 3rd. Who is he? I asked. An accountant, he said dryly, of a different office. He keeps ledgers that balance only if someone else pays. In the cuff, he let me watch him decide to answer. Meridian Co., a respectable firm that sells arrangements and collects weather. They smell of coals because the men who work there hate coal and pretend the river isn't in their mouths. He checked my face to see what I would do with the name. Don't write it down. I don't write in public anymore, I said. Good, he said. Save that for rooms with fog. Act 3, rising pressure. If Act 2 is learning how to open small doors without letting the house burn, Act 3 began with the house learning my name and mispronouncing it on purpose. The accountant's office put me between 2 errands that didn't share a language. 1, a charity trying to become a business without becoming a thief. 2, a patrol schedule written by a man who liked commas too much. I folded one, punctuated the other, and left both on the desk of someone who would be congratulated publicly for discovering my work. Melissa returned from Miller Crest with oil on her cheek and a sentence that made Benson clap with a rag in his hand. They paid me for the hour I took to correct the drawing, she said. I am keeping the drawing. They can have the truth. Write your name on the back, I said, and she did, small and straight. The coin warmed at a corner that had never before believed in luck. A young constable was about to turn left into a story. I intercepted with the universal solvent of bureaucracy. Message at the post, I lied and held out an empty hand. He placed his impatience in it, turned right, and avoided a door that would have closed behind him with a sigh. I need no rule, some acts are too small to catalog and therefore become the city's habits. In the hall, Justice brought a chart of invitations to a ball that wasn't exactly a ball. Names hung on strings like ornaments, weightless until someone decided to take offense. The hostess wants to collect power by staging civility, she said. If we allow it, a bad law will happen in silk. The hanged man's adjusted, sinking the boat. We set him to rearranging the seating so a man likely to apologize would sit beside a woman likely to forgive. You can build a bridge from 2 small regrets, Justice said, and the fog politely didn't disagree. I asked the hall a question that felt like picking a lock. If the hand with the clove cuff reaches again, let the door remember that hands must be invited. The fog refused dramatics and wrote the rule down where I can't see it. 2 nights later, the reading room convened a habit. The iron-minus gray woman set the brass minute between us like a coin we all had earned. We're going to give this to the city, she said, by teaching a room to count differently. We practiced a 9- second silence where men of a certain type expect applause between thoughts. It broke 2 sentences we had meant to resist and saved us the work. 9 seconds is long enough for a foolish idea to feel lonely, she said. It leaves. Leaving the museum, I found the watchmaker locking his door. Your brass is out of fashion, he observed cheerfully. Men want minutes they haven't turned. So, them slow watches, I said. I do, he said, but then they blame time. He tipped an imaginary hat. You, however, seem to keep both hands. At the corner, the listener adjusted the angle of a street by pausing under a lamp and letting men recalculate their paths to avoid looking as if they were recalculating their paths. That is a rare civic art. Meridian Co. We'll begin staging favors that look like weather, he said without reading. You'll be offered shade on sunny days, shortcuts on long ones, names when you didn't ask. Say no, and you'll be escorted into delays. Say yes, and you'll discover the bill in a room that asks you to leave your coat. How I refuse elegantly. Blame me, he said. They expect me to be rude. I returned to the moon with an expression of having forgotten why it came, but too proud to leave. Under it, rooms that pretend to be churches rehearsed politeness. The coin warmed and cooled like a pulse with an opinion. We arranged small stones until wheels had to consider their futures twice. The hanged man's crew hauled across river in bad weather and came home with all their fingers. Just a smoothed a comma that made a courtroom breathe. I balanced a ledger while telling a boy with a tidy part to go home. No handbills tonight or you'll miss the only decent joke. What joke? The one you tell yourself when you discover you grew up without asking permission. He went home. I hoped to laugh. The city laughed like a pipe that has remembered not to burst. And then because Act 3 must, something asked for a price that could not be paid in washers and minutes. Miller Crest Spoiler House. The one Melissa had befriended with wire and mercy. Acquired a leak at the wrong joint. It wasn't sabotage, it was contempt. Men had decided a limit didn't apply and watched their decision discover heat. The foreman called for buckets, buckets called for men, men called for luck. The luck arrived late and demanded back pay. Melissa was already at the valve when I reached the yard. She hadn't seen me, she was busy arguing with physics in a tone that concedes neither victory nor defeat. The listener appeared like a scent you begin to notice only after it's saved you once. We need the room to think, he said. You can do that. How? Teach fear to stand in a queue, he said, and tell pride to go home. I stepped onto a box because boxes forgive speeches. You, rag, I said, pointing at a man who needed a job with a name. You, thumper. You, shut the outer valve by 3 turns, not 2, not 4. You, watch that gauge and say now and now arrives, not before because you're eager, not after because you're kind. Men obey because sentences with numbers belong to them, they like it when the world remembers. Melissa reached the joint, tight and with the intimacy people reserve for lovers and machines, and swore a 1- syllable prayer the boiler respected. The leak reconsidered public life. The gauge stopped composing a tragedy. The listener counted seconds with his hat brim, I counted them with the brass minutes. In my pocket like a saint, I do not worship. At now, the outer valve accepted reason. Heat stopped arguing. Steam sat down on the floor and read yesterday's paper. After, the foreman looked as if someone had stolen his accident. He thanked me by ignoring me and congratulated Melissa by not taking credit for her. That is as good as those men do quickly. We named a rule on the bronze. Count aloud. When fear stands in queues, hands can work. The fog kept the rule where it keeps other emergency tools. Under my door, the careful hand. We noticed the 4th step. Good. Keep counting. Bring no bullet. Bring your patience. I folded the note and did not let it ruin the taste of stew. The man with my outline did not return for 3 nights. When he did, the red ring was only a rumor and the city was busy pretending to be harmless. He stood at the end of the table and read the flecks on the bronze as if reading a weather map. You are paying in small coins, he said. The ledger will demand round numbers. I owe no round numbers, I said. I prefer change. You will prefer it less, he said, when a man you love asks for a price you can't afford. Which man? That's the price, he said, and left. In the hall, Justice wrote 2 circles in the condensation, her breath left on the table's edge and refused to join them. If he forces you to choose, she said, choose the bridge. Always the thing that connects. Doors are for men who can afford keys. Bridges are for the rest of us. The hanged man set his hand on my wrist, anchored to a thought. If a man tells you the 3rd step is sacred, kick it until it's just wood. We laughed because it sounded like blasphemy and felt like self-defense. The reading room offered me a new sentence. A city is a map of its hesitations. We traced ours and found one in front of Meridian Co. A pause people take before walking past their doors, as if the building borrowed seconds. We don't fight houses, the iron-minus gray woman said. We teach feet new routes. She drew. We walked. The pause moved to a bakery and dissolved under sugar at Nina. Ooh, The listener brought me no errands one day, which meant the city wanted to see who I was when no one asked. I bought 2 bolts of thread, one I could name, one I could not. I carried coal and pretended it did not teach me anything. I sat with Benson while he pretended not to wait for a letter. Melissa, a boy 7 years younger than her, had a measure twice in a world that encourages men to cut once and blame the board. That night, the coin warmed in a room with Latin and tea. I stood at the door and did nothing but bravest kind of hinge. The window learned to open again. The circle learned to stop at 2. And because a story is a machine, it found its pressure valve. The accountant's office door shut harder than usual. The stamp minus desk woman stamped with a rhythm meant to cheer herself. The listener appeared with no hat and a sentence that forgot courtesy. Meridian Co. invited itself to the foundry, he said. They brought a donation with a ledger attached. If it's signed, a staircase will be added and half the doors will become merely decorative. Who must refuse? The foreman, he said. He will not. He likes staircases with names on plaques. Then who can refuse? Anyone whose signature is required and who does not depend on expensive lunches to believe in himself. Me, I said, and hated how proud my mouth tried to be. Not you, he corrected. You don't work there. Your sister does. Melissa looked at the paper and read its habits before its nouns. It demands my name so it can claim my work with it, she said. It will measure me and keep the measuring stick. She nodded, a motion that had the gravity of notarized decisions. I refuse. The foreman floundered. Polite men from Meridians smiled with their teeth covered. The listener leaned against it or framed like a man who would have to be asked twice to leave and intended to enjoy it. I arranged a chair for someone who needed to sit, and the act of sitting made the room notice its own arrogance. The paper did not acquire a signature. Outside, the ring considered returning and decided to be whether in some other city for the evening. In the hall, we named 2 rules and burned one. We kept bridge first. We kept count aloud. We burned a rule that wanted to pretend men are problems and not weather. The fog approved our pyre with silence. Under my door, finally, an impolite note written by a hand that likes snails. Stop moving chairs. Stop counting other people's minutes. Stop being brave where we can see you. A smudge of clove stained the margin. I set the note beside the brass minute and the coin. Or I told the table, which had never lied. We'll spend differently. The city twitched the way a horse does when a fly chooses a cruel place. I slept like furniture. In the morning, the bakery woman asked whether I liked cherries. I said yes and discovered I had bought plums. She smiled as if that had been her plan. When I reached the stair that counts, someone had chalked over the groove at the 3rd step with a word that looked like a name and wasn't. I wiped it away with my sleeve. Name the rule, just as said that night when I reported the deletion. Erase invitations, I said. If a door writes itself where your foot goes, teach it to misspell. The fog took the rule and tucked it somewhere near tithe and mirror do, where debts are cataloged until they forget to be frightening. I waited for the man with my outline. He did not arrive. Perhaps he had learned to count differently. Perhaps he was buying clothes. Meridian Co. learned a new trick. They stopped sending notes to my door and started leaving opportunities in other people's pockets. A foreman discovered a voucher for new tools that required only one signature. His. A pastor received a donation that insisted on being announced before it was counted. The bakery woman was told she'd won a barrel of sugar provided she moved her shop 2 doors closer to their office for footfall. None of these was wicked. All of them were arrangements that looked like weather. The listener called it cloud minus seating with manners. At Millercrest, a parcel arrived form Alyssa wrapped in paper that had never met poverty. Inside lay a booklet with perfect diagrams and an invitation written by a hand that had fallen in love with its own adjectives. Meridian Scholar, Facilities Access Lecture Hall, modest stipend. At the bottom, in smaller letters, the hinge. All work performed under this program becomes property of the sponsor. She didn't curse. She took out a pencil and underlined the last line twice until it remembered how to be ugly. They want my skill to look like theirs, she said. Refuse in a way that can't be tittied, I said. I'll return the booklet with a drawing of a lock, she said, and I believed her. That night, the hall wore patience staler to crisis. I placed the booklet on the bronze and asked the fog to read it without learning its perfume. Justice skimmed, lips pursed, and pushed it away with 2 fingers. This is a door that eats skis, she said. Return the invitation with a hinge attached. We drafted a refusal that couldn't be displayed as a trophy. I accept instruction free of ownership. I refuse ownership disguised as instruction. The hanged man grunted, which in his mouth meant to men. After we worked, I asked for a tithe of memory because the clove minus slow watch had begun to tug at sleep. Only the angle, I told the fog, not the face. Just the angle of the man's wrist when he checked the time before the mirror offered me a place. The fog waved, then sold me the angle for a memory I would miss later. The exact roughness of the stairs banister under my palm at age 9 left quietly. In exchange, I saw how the cuff rode the bull. Higher than fashion, lower than sense. So the watch could keep its drag without snagging. It was not a revelation, it was a signature you could read with closed eyes. Morning enforced itself by being practical. I carried the booklet back to Miller Crest, where the foreman had found pride in behaving decently for a week and thought he might try to. Melissa handed him the refusal and the drawing of a hinge that would lengthen the life of a machine he loved more than his ambition. He read both twice, then passed them to the master. Machine is the way men pass bread when they want to appear neutral and end up being good. Tell Meridian, the machinist said, we enjoy owning our mistakes. He returned the booklet. Melissa returned him the hinge. The room accepted the exchange like a contract signed in a language nobody would admit to knowing. On the street, a procession reheated last week's hymn and served it as proof. The coin warmed at my breastbone in a way that suggested luck had found a second job. I stepped where I could be nobody. The men with the banner arrived late. The boy with the tidy part arrived early and discovered he preferred cake to politics. A man with a cuff set his watch by a clock that was wrong on purpose and walked away north, the kind of north that shortens streets. Not yet, I told the part of me that wanted to follow him. Family, then principle. I bought sugar. I carried it home like a bribe paid to a future I could almost afford. That evening, the reading room rehearsed the 9-second silence long enough to make a dangerous speech bite its own tongue. The iron-gray woman struck 3 words from a line that had been built to behave cruelly while dressed in charity. If you remove the drum, she murmured, men cannot march over the softest people in the room. We left with no certificate and a sentence that would spoil a banquet if anyone read it at the table. Meridian answered by changing rooms. They rented a hall that had once been a warehouse and hung it with curtains that pretended to be velvet. Their gala was advertised as a night of instruments for the city's young. The instruments were edgers and pens. Justice needed to be inside, which meant the hanged man. I needed to be invisible in the kitchens where the sound of charity washes its face. I wore a borrowed jacket that fit like a favor and learned the kitchen's geography. A door that sticks, a step that likes ankles, a window that decides whether to fog depending on the truth content of a conversation. We placed small stones. I loosened a screw on a doorstop so the corridor would breathe. The hanged man tilted a tray so a man with a banner under his coat would have to pull his elbow in and miss his cue. Just as centered on the arm of a gentleman who understood that escorting a woman to a room is different from taking her there. She took a glass she wouldn't drink in a seat that wouldn't show up on the official plan. Our plan required boredom with delicate hands. The speeches practiced their thunder in mirrors beforehand. The first announced generosity with such technique that men forgot to look for the bucket beneath it. The second joined law to pity and mislabel both. The third, small, awkward, genuine, arrived from a school teacher who believed literally in light. She held up a dull lamp and said 2 coins could kindle it for a week. The room shifted, embarrassed by its larger coins. Justice smiled where no one could collect the credit. Meridian had hoped to buy a staircase. With applause, it purchased a cupboard full of lamps instead and didn't know where to send the bill. Backstage, a man with a cuff-stamped mic stopped me with his elbow as if elbows came with warrants. Run this to the counting room, he said, handing me a packet dressed as theater. Directly. Where is directly? I asked, half minus bowing so he would look down and miss how my eyes made a map. Left past the mirror, right at the tall plant that believes it is a tree. He smiled with someone else's teeth. Don't get lost in fog. I didn't. I walked directly to the wrong counting room. The one with the door that sticks and the clerk who despises pens. I asked him to hum while he stamped. He hummed as men do who practice once as boys and discovered their talent would save them from small sorrows. The packet opened itself under his rhythm. A ledger written in weather. Promises in, proof out, minutes banked under other men's names. I did not change numbers. I changed commas. Commas can order men to do unplanned acts of mercy without telling them they have been enlisted. Then I returned the packet to a counting room with a taller plant that had never learned to be a tree. We named that later. Move the comma. The fog kept it with a private smile. The night did not reward us. It simply ended without asking anyone to pay in blood. That is reward enough. The city collected itself to look like a week. I carried forms, and the stamp minus desk woman invented a new rhythm to keep boredom from becoming unkind. The listener practiced standing at corners as if he were a hinge the street turned upon without noticing. Melissa installed the hinge she had drawn and put her name on the maintenance sheet in letters that refused to apologize. Benson, who does not usually trust paper, began to keep a notebook of jokes that would need time to become true. Then the pressure changed. Meridian Co. didn't bother with processions or galas. They sent men to the foundry with roll drawings and a carpenter 2 measure frames for a stair that had not been agreed to. "We'll expedite," their man said smoothly. "The city rewards initiative."